Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. To mark the occasion, here's my review of Sid Meier's Civilization 3, along with both of its expansion packs, Play the World and Conquests, all of which is available for PC and Mac. This is a turn-based 4X strategy game and the sequel to Sid Meier's Civilization 2. It was developed by Firaxis Games and originally published by Infogrames, although 2K would later buy up the studio, and from then on out it would be published under 2K's moniker. But that wouldn't be until 2005, which is also when Civilization 4 was released. In between the release of this game in 2001 and then, there were also two expansion packs. Play the World released in 2002, with the so-called Gold Edition following up shortly thereafter, which included the base game and that expansion, and the second expansion, Conquest, released in 2003, with the complete edition of the game including both expansion packs releasing in 2004. And while the base game and the Conquest's expansions were both rather well received, the Play the World expansion was generally not that well received, particularly because it was primarily a multiplayer expansion and the multiplayer functionality just didn't work very well. In addition to just generally being rather buggy and often quite laggy, the multiplayer also had some pretty serious desynchronization problems, particularly if you were playing the new turnless mode, which was an interesting idea that was designed to try to blend the playstyles of turn-based strategy and real-time strategy, but it just didn't work very well. It constantly desynchronized, it was even buggier than just the basic multiplayer, and its complete failure ultimately ended up in the mode not returning for later Civilization games. Of course, it is worth mentioning that around the time this game was released, multiplayer in strategy games, particularly turn-based strategy games, was still being figured out, so you have to cut the game some slack in that regard, and the multiplayer functions are only one part of the game, and frankly the least important part of this. And that of course brings me to what exactly we're dealing with here. Is this a proper follow-up to Civilization 2? How does it compare with later entries in the series? And does it manage to stand on its own as a proper 4X strategy game? Well, before I start delving into this, I do want to mention that this was actually my introduction to the Civilization series. I didn't get a chance to play Civilization 1 or 2 back in the day, but I did get a copy of Civilization 3 Gold right around the time that Conquest was released, and I didn't get a chance to play Conquest until much later on when I got the complete edition on Steam. So now that I have the background out of the way, let's go ahead and start delving right into this and find out exactly what we're dealing with. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which is a major step up over the previous game in the series, although to be fair, Civilization 2 was released in 1996 and really didn't look all that good even in its day. Civilization 3, on the other hand, features some rather nice 2D visuals that still hold up really well even to this day, and surprisingly enough, they actually scale to modern resolutions quite well. Now, ordinarily the game runs in 800 by 600, and the main menu sort of still does, even if you do run it in 1080p like you're seeing in this video, but all you have to do to get it to display in a modern resolution, whatever your screen's resolution is in fact, is add a single line to the INI file, and that causes it to display in whatever your monitor's resolution is and be borderless full screen. So you do have to keep in mind that if you have a multi-monitor setup, then you're not going to be able to use the scroll functions on the sides of the screen in the same way you normally would, but that's easily remedied by just using the minimap or using the arrow keys to scroll. And of course, this being a turn-based game, you don't really need to worry about quick reactions to anything, so it really isn't that big of a problem. It's just a bit of an odd compatibility issue. But unfortunately, that's not the only compatibility issue the game has. Particularly on Windows 10, there are some weird performance issues here and there, and there's also this odd issue with the audio cutting out when you go to the diplomacy screen. But it does come back after you get off of the diplomacy screen, so it's definitely a bit weird, but nothing game-breaking. And in fact, everything scales so well, and it still runs so well, that you'd be hard-pressed to think of this as a game from 2001 if you didn't already know that. It's got a very clean, very minimal interface that doesn't get in your way, and bonus points, it doesn't actually stretch when you scale it to modern resolutions, which is very nice. The visuals themselves are not stretched. They're very easy to distinguish what the things in the environments are. You can easily tell what units are which. And even the pre-rendered videos that you'll encounter every so often in the game still look rather nice. In fact, the only major issue with the visuals is that there is one particular faction color that will blend in with the environment, although it doesn't blend in with all of them, and that's that sort of dark tan, near brown color that you'll see when I'm playing as Russia in this. It only blends in with some of the environments, and it does occasionally make some of your units a bit difficult to distinguish, but it's really not that major of an issue because, again, this is a turn-based game, so you have all the time you need to stop and take a look at what you've got in front of you and determine exactly what you need to do with it. So as far as the visuals go, there's really not much to complain about here unless you're just one of those people who really hates 2D visuals in general. But what about the sound design? Well, that's where the game falls mostly into the territory of does what it needs to do. Several of the sound effects sound like they were straight out of a generic library, and while they certainly get the job done, there's definitely nothing impressive there. There's no voice acting in the game at all, so there's nothing to speak about there, and that leaves the music to sort of pick up the slack, and while it's certainly decent music, it's not really all that much to write home about. A few tracks in the game are particularly good, especially once you get into the later parts of the game, but there's not a huge variety in the tracks themselves, so they do eventually get a bit repetitive. But like with the visuals, there's really no major problem with the sound in general, so they've done a pretty solid job with the presentation overall, and it still holds up fairly well to this day. But of course what really matter in a video game are the story and the gameplay, although in this particular case there is no story, so everything falls to the gameplay. The only story you get, in air quotes there, is the basic premise of starting from the dawn of civilization and going all the way up to roughly 2050 or so, depending on whether you win the game before then or not. And to that end, there are 6 victory conditions that you can fulfill in order to win the game. 2 of these will be very familiar to you if you've played Civilization 1 and 2, which are the Conquest victory, where you win by eliminating all the other factions, and the Space Race victory, where you win by constructing all the various parts of a spaceship, assembling them all in one location, and then sending that ship off to Alpha Centauri. There's also the Histograph victory, which is just the timeout victory, where when it hits 2050 AD, the game ends, and whoever had the highest average score throughout the entirety of the game ends up winning. But then there are the new victory conditions, which are Domination, where you have to control 2/3 of the game's landmass and have 2/3 of the world's population in your cities in order to win. The Cultural victory, where you need to have a city with a cultural value of 20,000, or your civilization being at 100,000 and at least twice as much as any rival in order to win. And the Diplomacy victory, where you can found the United Nations, and if you are voted as the leader, then you win. This already gives you far more paths to victory than in both of the previous Civilization games, but there's also some additional modifiers that you can add on top of these to change the way that the particulars actually play out. Now these are primarily for multiplayer, but you can actually use them in single player as well, and things get even crazier when you do that, because they include things like the Regicide modifier, where everybody starts with a king unit, and if that king unit is killed, then you immediately lose the game. Then there's the Elimination modifier, where you set it to a certain number of cities, and if you manage to lose that many cities, then you also lose the game. There's even a Capture the Flag mode called Capture the Princess, where you have a princess unit in your capital, and if the other players manage to take that unit and bring it back to their capital, then they score points. And of course you do the same to them. It's a rather weird twist on what you're used to from Civilization, even if you've played later games in the series after this. And a lot of that just comes from the Play the World expansion, where they just introduced a bunch of these things to try to mess with the multiplayer and see what actually works for Civilization multiplayer, and obviously not all of it works out all that well. In fact, I'd say the only one that actually works out fairly well is the Elimination modifier. But regardless of what you have set up as your victory conditions and the modifiers for them, you then pick your civilization from a list of 31 civilizations as of the Conquest expansion, which also includes all the ones from Play the World, and you'll immediately notice that there are major differences between Civilization 2 and Civilization 3 in how everything is set up. Not only are there more victory conditions, but each civilization's leader now has 2 traits that will give different bonuses from a selection of 8 traits in total, and each civilization also has its own unique unit that replaces one of the standard units. So to give you an example, the Roman civilization has the unique unit of Legionary, which replaces the Swordsman and is a more powerful unit overall. overall, and they are also commercial and militaristic. Commercial meaning they have a reduction to corruption, which is basically just lost income, as well as producing additional commerce in their cities, and they also start the game with the alphabet tech, and then from the militaristic trait, they start with the warrior code tech and also get some bonuses to the unit progression where their units will level up faster than the other civilizations, and military buildings are produced at a discount. In the base game and the Play of the World expansion, there were only 6 of these traits, but in the Conquest expansion they introduced seafaring and agricultural as additional traits, and they rebalanced a lot of them to make sure that things were a bit more spread out as well. And then after you've picked your civilization and your starting parameters for the world generation and all that sort of thing, and you jump into the game proper, you'll find all the familiar hallmarks of the Civilization series. It is a turn-based strategy game. You have your cities that you build, and you can build improvements within those cities. You can build wonders of the world to give yourself some major bonuses, like, say, Sun Tzu's Art of War, which will put a free barracks in every single city that you have on the same continent. But of course, only one of each individual wonder of the world can be built anywhere in the world, so you do have to keep that in mind, and more often than not, the AI will snipe those out from under you, which is incredibly annoying. But then there are the smaller wonders, which are not limited to one per the entire world, but are rather limited to one per civilization. So while every single faction can build their own heroic epic, for example, you can only have one heroic epic in your empire. Aside from that, you have the city view, where you can go into your cities and place your workers on individual tiles to maximize their effectiveness, although you can of course just let the game do it for you, but it's not going to be optimized in those cases. There's still a technology tree where you can research different technologies to get access to new buildings, new units that replace old ones, whatever the case may be, on top of course just various benefits like additional worker actions or even just passive bonuses. And some of the technologies even reveal new resources, which is a pretty major change from Civilization 2. Now you not only have bonus resources, but also, in the first entry in the series to have them, strategic and luxury resources. Luxury resources help make your citizens happy and thus avoid civil disorder and that sort of thing, but the strategic resources are the really interesting part because they can pretty dramatically affect the way you actually play the game. You use the strategic resources to construct various units throughout the game, things like needing iron to be able to make swordsmen, or if you're the Romans, to make the legionary, or if you are, say, the French, then you need saltpeter to build your musketeers, or if you're using certain units, then you might actually need a combination of materials. So let's say you're playing as the Ottomans and you want to make their unique unit, which is the Sipahi, then you need both horses and saltpeter to be able to train them. Obviously, more powerful units are going to require these resources, and once you get later on into the game, you're going to find that more and more units actually start to need them. And while that's certainly interesting from a strategic standpoint of needing to control the strategic resources and go out of your way to get them, unfortunately, the game is extremely stingy on the resources to the point where it gets downright absurd sometimes. To give you a prime example, one of the earliest resources you can gain access to is iron, and oddly enough, despite iron in reality being one of the most common metals on the planet, it is so hard to find in this thing that I have actually gone entire games from the start of the game at 4000 BC to the end timer at 2050 AD without having any iron in my empire at all. And even if you're playing as a civilization whose unique unit doesn't require a strategic resource, that sort of thing can still get incredibly irritating because you get to the point where you actually start needing these strategic resources and the game just doesn't give them to you. This means that more often than not, you're going to have to go wildly far out of your way to find these resources and find some way of getting them into your empire, and that can involve, of course, trading with other civilizations or going on a conquest spree, although that's a lot easier said than done, but I'll get to that in a moment when I talk about the combat system. Regardless of how you go about it, the need for these strategic resources does mean that the game is pretty heavily focused on expansion, and not just expansion, but extremely aggressive expansion, which is something that people are really not used to if they played more recent games in the Civ series, particularly Civ 5 and Civ 6, where such hyper-aggressive expansion is actually punished in the long run by increasing the costs of your empire to a ludicrous degree. That doesn't happen in Civ 3, although you do have the corruption and waste mechanic, which does become a pretty nasty thorn in your side once your empire does hit particularly large proportions, because a lot of the corruption mechanic is based on where your palace is located, and the further out from your palace you get, the higher the corruption and waste is going to be. You can construct certain city improvements like the courthouse, and also certain smaller wonders like the Forbidden Palace in order to ameliorate the effects of the corruption and waste mechanic, but it never really goes away entirely, and once your expansion gets to certain amounts, you're just going to have to deal with it. Of course, by that point, you've probably built up your economy to such a degree where the corruption and waste really isn't that big of a problem, so it's a bit of a mixed bag on that front. You will also notice that the type of government you're using has a pretty dramatic effect on how your empire maintenance costs are going to play out, because certain government types are built more around commerce, like say democracy or republic, and others are built more around military might and martial law, like say the monarchy or communism, and then of course there's the two additional ones that are even more nuanced versions of those that were introduced in the Conquest expansion, which are feudalism and fascism, and those have their own weird quirks about them on top of the weird quirks that you already saw from the government types in the base game. Regardless of which option you pick though, any of them is a better option than what you start with, which is despotism. But you do have to keep in mind that when you switch government types, you do have a period of anarchy where you basically can't produce anything and you can't do any research, so you definitely want to wait for a good opportunity to switch government types. So that all plays a major role in the way you're going to go about expanding your borders, but there's also the culture factor to consider, because this was the first game in the series to introduce culture, and that dramatically affects the way you actually expand your borders. Not only can you just build additional cities on top of what you already have, but you can build various improvements in your cities in order to have them actually produce culture, and as they continue producing culture, eventually their borders will actually expand, allowing you to take more area under your control without having to build additional cities. And of course, you'll also be using culture in a defensive capacity because you don't want to fall victim to a culture victory from one of the other civilizations, so you'll definitely be wanting to produce some culture of your own anyway. And while the culture mechanics in this particular game are fairly primitive compared to later entries in the series, they still actually just work very well overall in this one, even though they are a lot simpler. And culture's not the only mechanic you're going to be seeing that on. You can also see it with the diplomatic agreements and the espionage system, where they're fairly primitive compared to later entries in the series, but they're a dramatic step up over what you had in Civilization 2, where in Civilization 2 you basically had, am I at war with you or am I at peace with you? And that was basically it. Here you have all kinds of agreements you can enter, where you can enter various military alliances, non-aggression pacts, mutual protection pacts. Whatever the case may be, you can enter into some pretty hefty negotiations with the other civilizations, although they are generally pretty heavily weighted against you on that, and it does ultimately contribute to making the game feel a lot more robust and well-rounded than the previous entries in the Civ series, and even to a slightly lesser degree some of the later entries in the series as well, at least until they got some additional patches and some expansions. They even made some noticeable improvements to the combat system compared to Civilization 2, where you no longer have the idea of the stack death, where it's basically just a stack goes up against another stack and then one stack dies and the other one moves along. In this one, you still have stacks, but you have each individual unit going up against the other individual units of the particular stacks. And while that's definitely a marked improvement over the stack death BS that was in Civ 2, unfortunately the game still uses random number generation to determine the outcomes of battles, and thus you can end up with one of the most infamous quirks of this game, which is that if the other units are just really lucky, you can have situations where Stone Age units are going up against things like tanks, and winning. It certainly doesn't happen quite as often as certain people would have you believe, but because it is just such blatant RNG BS, unfortunately, those are the moments that will often stick out in your mind, and I have personally lost count of the number of times where I've had my tanks go up against archers and lose. But by the same token, I have had situations where some of my wimpy units have gone up against much stronger units and still won, so it does happen both ways, and it's pretty amusing when it happens in your favor, but obviously when it happens against you, it's incredibly irritating. And the game does have a pretty nasty habit of favoring the AI factions over yours as far as the RNG is concerned, so be prepared to have lots of your units get lost to enemy attacks, or go up against enemies that they should easily be able to defeat and then lose, purely because the game is biased against the player. Of course, even with the game stacking the deck against the player, the AI is still not all that great, although it's definitely a hell of a lot better than Civ 2's, which was just completely idiotic, so it's at least an improvement, but that's something that the entire series has really struggled with, even to this day with Civ 6. And if they don't know how to make the AI challenging now without resorting to cheap tricks, then you know they didn't know back in 2001 when this was made. This results in the single player experience being a bit uneven sometimes. Depending on which difficulty setting you're playing on, it's either complete pushover or it's just incredibly cheap to the point where it gets incredibly frustrating. Now admittedly that is par for the course as far as Sid Meier's Civilization is concerned, especially when you take a look at these older games in the series like this. But that does mean this requires quite a bit more patience than Civ 5 and Civ 6 do, and thus it's a lot harder to recommend to a general audience. That said, it does require less patience than Civ 4 does, if only because this is more of a refinement and gentle expansion of the gameplay mechanics from Civ 2, instead of the frankly overcomplicated mess that Civ 4 turned out to be. And that does ultimately bring up an interesting point, the place that this actually occupies in the Civilization series. Because if you ask fans of the Civilization series what their favorite entries in the series are, almost none of them are going to tell you it's Civ 3. They're almost exclusively going to say it's either Civ 4 or Civ 2. And from what I've seen, it's generally disproportionately leaning towards Civ 4 rather than 2. So what happened with Civ 3? Well, part of the problem is that certain features from Civ 2 that people really liked were actually removed in this, like the Civil War mechanic and the caravans, and so you had that contingent of people who just didn't want to adjust to the new gameplay systems and just wrote off the game entirely, and then of course the people who were just a bit disappointed with it and therefore just went back to playing Civ 2 instead because they just ended up preferring it. Then of course there's the Play the World expansion, which was a very misguided attempt at putting multiplayer into a game that wasn't really built for it, and it just never worked properly. Even if you could manage to get a game that didn't disconnect, it would be horrendously laggy and just generally a very unpleasant experience to play, so most people just didn't bother with the multiplayer at all. And if you take that aside, the Play the World expansion is incredibly bare bones. It's only 8 civilizations, a couple of new world wonders, and that's pretty much it, really. The Conquest expansion was certainly meatier, featuring what you would expect as far as new civilizations, new world wonders, new units, that sort of thing, but also implementing a new set of scenarios, which are predefined games that allow you to select your faction and then hop into an already pre-built area for you to mess around with, and to have unique units, unique techs, and unique objectives that you just don't get during a normal game. And they range from things like the Rise of Rome, which is set during the Punic Wars, to the Napoleonic Wars, to World War II, and all sorts of other scenarios as well, each of which offers a different spin on Civ 3's gameplay, and is generally quite a bit shorter term than the typical campaign that you would go through in a Civ game, which is in no small part due to the fact that they intended these scenarios to be playable in multiplayer and to be faster paced than the normal campaign, so you can actually have a relatively decent paced multiplayer match. But of course the scenarios are all fully playable in single player as well, so you can avoid the multiplayer entirely with Conquest if you want and still reap all the benefits of it. So the game didn't really feel like a fully finished product until after the Conquest expansion had come out and you had all of the expansion content in one package, and by that point Civ 4 was already on the horizon and was a noticeable change in the technology that they were working with, going from the 2D engine engine to a 3D engine, although it ended up being Gamebryo, unfortunately. But it definitely impressed Civ fans a lot more than Civ 3 did, and it's honestly a bit of a shame because Civ 3 is an interesting proving ground for a lot of concepts that would ultimately become standard for the series from then on out. They certainly didn't get perfection with it, but if you take Civ 3 and both of its expansion packs and put them all together as one cohesive whole, then you end up with a Civilization game that admittedly is somewhat of a mixed bag, but it does succeed way more than it fails. And given that it was really the last hurrah of the classic style of Civilization game, before things got overly complicated with Civ 4, and Civ 5 presented a very different gameplay style, ultimately, Civ 3 is still a rather solid game, even with all of its problems, and even though it can be incredibly frustrating at times, because it still has that just one more turn quality about it that made the Civilization games so fun in the first place. That said, you do have to have rather high levels of patience to be able to get to the good stuff in this, and as a result, I have a hard time giving this anything higher than a 3 out of 5 with that stipulation. If you're willing to persevere through the game's faults, you'll find an easy to pick up, but difficult to master turn-based strategy game that really captures everything about the 4X genre that we know and love, but of course with some rather rough edges. And if you're going into this from a later Civilization game like Civ 4, 5, or 6, then you'll find this a lot easier to get into than Civilization 2, precisely because a lot of the basics that Civilization 3 introduced have since become standard for the series, even if Civ 3 constantly gets overlooked. And as icing on the cake, the list price at the time I'm making this video is $5 US, and it frequently goes on sale for 75% off, bringing it down to about $1.24. And they even updated the Steam version so that after GameSpy shut down, they actually reworked the multiplayer so now it goes through Steam servers instead, so multiplayer is actually playable again. Well, as playable as Civilization 3 multiplayer gets anyway. So if you're in the market for a 4X turn-based strategy game and you're looking for something a bit more old school than, say, Civ 5 or Civ 6, consider giving Civ 3 a shot. Just understand that you really have to know what you're getting yourself into on this one, and you're going to have to be rather patient with it. Thanks for watching.